I've always loved going out into the woods, ever since I was a kid. It's one of the only places where I feel like I can really think straight. No cars, no buzzing power lines, no people making small talk or waiting in lines. Just trees, dirt, wind, and quiet. That kind of silence you can only get far from everything. The kind that settles in your chest and makes it feel like you're the only person in the world. I still go out a few times a year. Nothing crazy, just long weekends, sometimes 4 or 5 days. I pack light, stay off the main trails, set up my tent where I won't run into anyone, and just enjoy the space. I fish, I read. Sometimes I don't do anything, just walk and listen. I never go too far off-grid. I keep a GPS and a backup battery, but I don't usually camp near other people. Not because I'm afraid of bears or wolves or anything like that. It's people I try to avoid. If I wanted to hear someone's Bluetooth speaker or their kids yelling into the trees, I'd go to a campground. This happened last fall. I had a few days off work and decided to take them before the weather turned. I drove out to a forest in the northern part of my state. Not remote enough to need a permit, but still far enough that I wouldn't run into families with RVs and folding tables. I won't say the name of the area, but it's got hills, creeks, a decent population of deer, and enough open flat areas to pitch a tent comfortably. I left my truck at a trailhead, walked about 5 or 6 miles in, then veered off into some thicker stuff once I found a spot that felt right. There was a small clearing ringed with pines, and the ground was mostly level and dry. No signs of other camps, no fire rings, no beer cans, no footprints, just raw forest. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and boiled some water for coffee as the sun went down. It was already chilly, and by the time the stars came out, it was cold enough that the fire felt necessary. I bundled up in my jacket, sat on a log, and just stared at the flames. That first night was peaceful. Still, I heard an owl at one point and something rustling in the brush a few 100 feet off, but it didn't sound big. Probably a rabbit or maybe a raccoon. I didn't even think about it. It's the woods. There's always something moving out there. I turned in around 10 and slept fine. The next day, I wandered around a bit. Didn't go too far, just up the ridge behind the camp, following a deer trail to a nice overlook where I could see the trees stretching for miles. The wind had picked up, and it was colder than I expected, so I didn't stay long. Back at camp, I made a small lunch, built the fire back up, and settled in with a paperback I'd brought. That's when I started noticing the quiet. I've been out enough to know what normal forest sounds like. Wind in the trees, bird calls, little snapping twigs from animals moving around. But this was different. The wind was still there, but everything else felt muffled. Not gone exactly, just dialed down. I didn't think much of it at first. Just figured maybe the cold had the animals bedded down early. But as the sun dropped and the shadows got long, I realized I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. I built up the fire again. It had been warm enough during the day that I hadn't needed it, but I suddenly wanted it big, bright, the kind of fire that pushes back the dark and makes you feel like you've carved out a little safe space. I sat there for hours, didn't even read, just fed the fire, watched the shadows shift, and listened. And then the eyes. I was shining my flashlight out past the tree line, just scanning, something I do sometimes when I start feeling jumpy, and I caught a flash of reflection, a shine. 2 little glowing spots between the trees, low to the ground. I figured it was a deer, or maybe a fox. Nothing unusual. But then it stood up. I swear to God. It rose from a crouch or something. The eyes stayed locked on me, and then just lifted. Higher than they should have. Like tall. Taller than any person I'd want to run into out here. I froze. The first thought I had was bear. But bears don't have eyes like that. And they don't move like that either. The way it stood was too smooth, too balanced. I kept the flashlight on it for a few seconds. The eyes blinked once, quick, human, and then it stepped back into the dark and disappeared. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed by the fire until it burned down to glowing coals, then got into the tent and kept the flashlight next to me, just in case. I didn't hear anything else. No footsteps, no branches breaking, but that silence was back. that strange, pressing stillness that made the inside of my head feel too loud. I told myself it had to be someone else. Another camper, a hunter maybe even a ranger, but I hadn't seen anyone for miles, and something about those eyes, it didn't feel right. Human eyes don't reflect light at night. Not like that. Not with that distinct glow. I learned that fact years ago, and it always stuck with me. Animal eyes shine. Human eyes don't. That's just how it is. So what the hell had I seen? By morning, the forest felt normal again. Birds chirping, squirrels rustling leaves. The same trees, same light, same cold air. I made breakfast and pretended everything was fine, but in the back of my head, I was already thinking about packing up early. I took a short hike that morning, just to clear my head. Went downhill, toward a small creek I'd heard the night before but hadn't visited yet. It was beautiful. Rocks covered in moss, water clear as glass, fallen trees crossing the stream like little bridges. I stayed maybe 20 minutes, took a few pictures, and turned back. When I got back to camp, I noticed something had changed. Nothing major, nothing that screamed sabotage or anything, but my backpack had been moved, just a little. It had been leaning against the log by the fire pit, and now it was lying flat on the ground, about 2 feet from where I left it. The zipper was halfway undone. Nothing missing as far as I could tell, but someone or something had been through my stuff. That was it for me. I broke camp in less than 20 minutes. Didn't even eat lunch. Just packed everything, doused the fire, and got moving. I decided to take a more direct route back to the truck. Not following the trail exactly, but heading in the general direction. My GPS kept me mostly on track. It was during that hike out, somewhere around the 2nd mile, that I stopped to catch my breath and saw another pair of eyes. Same glow, same height, same eerie stillness. It was maybe 50 feet off the trail behind a fallen log. I only saw the eyes for a second, but I knew it was watching me. I didn't run. I didn't yell. I just turned and kept walking, trying to stay calm. My legs felt like they weighed 100 pounds each, but I didn't stop again. Not until I was back at the truck with the doors locked. The rest of the drive home was a blur. Just trees and pavement and the occasional gas station. When I finally got back, I dumped all my gear into the garage and sat on my couch in silence for almost 2 hours. I've been camping since then, a few times, but never alone. And every time someone points a flashlight into the woods at night and we see something watching from the dark, those little twin reflections blinking back, I always tell them the same thing. Human retinas don't reflect light. If you see a pair of eyes shining in the dark, and they look like they're watching you, it's not a person. And if it stands up, leave. Just leave. I grew up in a rural part of northern Michigan, where the tree line felt like a wall between normal life and something older and quieter. The woods near our house were the kind you don't go into unless you have a reason. My parents always told me not to wander too far, and I mostly listened. But sometimes I didn't. Back then, I was bored a lot. I didn't have siblings, and our closest neighbor was half a mile away. I used to ride my bike up and down the gravel road, or toss rocks into the creek behind our shed. There was a camp about 2 miles back in the trees. Just a few old buildings, a bunkhouse, and a fire pit with rotted benches around it. Some Christian group had run summer camps there for years, but they shut it down after someone drowned in the lake. I think I was maybe 10 or 11 when I first found it. The buildings were mostly boarded up, but some of the windows had been broken, and the doors hung crooked on their hinges. It smelled like mildew and mice. I liked poking around out there. It felt like something left behind, like the people had just vanished instead of packing up. I stopped going out there after a while. It started to feel less like exploring and more like trespassing, even though nobody owned the place anymore. And I was getting older. I had school and then sports and then the internet. But the year I turned 19, I moved back home for a while. I dropped out of community college and couldn't really explain to anyone why. I was just tired all the time and couldn't focus. My parents said I could stay in the guest room for the summer if I helped around the house. I didn't want to be there, but I didn't know where else to go. Most days I stayed in my room or walked the edge of the woods with my hands in my pockets. Sometimes I went into town, just to sit in the library for the air conditioning and Wi-Fi. One afternoon, sometime in June, I went for a walk with no real plan. It had rained that morning, and the trees were still dripping. Everything smelled wet and green. I followed the old path that ran past the back field, just following my feet, I guess. I didn't realize where I was heading until I saw the first moss-covered sign nailed to a tree. Camp Alder Creek. Faded, the paint cracked. The place looked more or less how I remembered. The buildings were still there, a little more caved in, a little more overgrown. I walked past the old bathhouse, where the concrete had buckled from frost heaves. The bunks still had broken mattresses inside, bare springs poking up like ribs. I found a dry log near the fire pit and sat down. I didn't feel anything in particular. Not scared, not nostalgic, just there. I stayed for maybe half an hour. The woods were quiet, except for the usual birds and a few flies. Then I stood up and went home. That should have been it. But a few days later, I went back. I don't know why. Boredom, maybe. The kind of boredom that feels like pressure behind your eyes. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I just grabbed a bottle of water and set off around noon. I brought a flashlight and a small folding knife, even though I didn't expect to need them. This time, I wandered deeper into the woods behind the camp. There were more buildings back there, smaller ones I hadn't remembered, probably storage sheds. One of them had a rusty metal door half open. I looked inside and found a pile of old mattresses and plastic bins full of what looked like craft supplies and children's clothes, moldy, falling apart. I kept walking. Eventually, I found a path, almost hidden under dead leaves. Narrow but cleared at some point. I followed it for a while, until I reached a small creek and a mossy wooden bridge. It didn't look sturdy, but I crossed anyway, stepping carefully. Beyond that, the path seemed to vanish, but the trees were thinner in that direction, so I kept going. I remember thinking it was weird how quiet it was. No traffic, no wind. Even the birds were silent. And then I saw something ahead of me, a shape, person, sitting on the ground, leaning against a tree. I stopped. He was a kid, maybe 12 or 13, too thin, pale. His face was turned away, but I could see that his arms were scraped up, like he'd fallen into thorns. He wasn't moving. I called out, not out loud, just in my head, instinctively, but nothing happened. I took a step closer. That's when he turned and looked at me. His face was blank, but there was something off about his eyes. Not afraid, not relieved, just watching. He didn't get up, didn't speak, just stared. I raised my hand, like a wave, unsure what else to do. He didn't respond. I said, "You okay?" But the words felt heavy and wrong. He didn't answer. I took another step and felt something shift in the air, like pressure, like when you walk into a room where someone's been fighting and you can still feel it. Then I noticed something behind him, a small shape, a shoe, pink, muddy, lying sideways in the brush. I froze. My stomach turned. The kid didn't move. His eyes didn't blink. I stepped back. 1 foot, then another. He stood up. He was smaller than I expected. His limbs looked awkward, like he hadn't grown into them yet. He didn't say anything, just stared and started walking toward me. I turned and walked fast, then jogged, then ran. Branches whipped at my face, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know how far I ran, but when I finally stopped, my lungs burned, and I was alone. Nothing but trees and my own breath in my ears. I made it home eventually. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about that pink shoe, the kid's arms, the way he just stared. The next morning, I woke up early and drove into town. I went to the police station and told them what I saw. A boy alone in the woods, might have been hurt. I didn't mention the shoe, didn't mention the feeling. They sent someone out there. I waited all day for a call, but nothing came. Around 5, I drove back and asked if they found anything. They said no. No signs of a kid, just some old camp buildings and an animal carcass near the creek. Probably a fox. I didn't go back after that. Not for a long time, but it stuck in my head. The kid's face, the strange silence, the pink shoe. Months passed. Then a year. I moved out of my parents' place and started working in construction. Life got busier. I told myself I'd imagined most of it. But last fall, I saw something on the local news. A girl had gone missing 2 towns over, 12 years old, vanished while walking home from school. They interviewed her parents, showed a picture. I felt sick when I saw the photo. Her shoes, they were pink, same kind I'd seen in the woods. I didn't tell anyone. What could I say? That I saw a shoe years ago, out in the woods? That some weird kid stared at me, and I ran? I left it alone. But last week I saw something else. A thread online. A guy talking about an old camp deep in the woods near Traverse City. Said he found a dead fox there with its insides torn out. Said he heard footsteps at night and saw a flashlight flicker in the trees. I messaged him. We talked for a while. He said the camp was full of trash, graffiti, broken furniture, but also new things. Snack wrappers, water bottles, a backpack. He took pictures. I saw one of them, inside the bunkhouse, on the floor near the back wall. A shoe, pink, same type again. I don't know who that kid was. I don't know what happened out there, but I think he's still out there. And I think he's not alone anymore. I haven't gone back. I won't, but someone should, because whatever's out there, it didn't stop, and I'm scared that it never will. I was probably around 11 or 12 when it happened, old enough to remember the trip clearly, but young enough that most of the responsibility for anything serious fell on the adults. We were up in Washington, near the Cowlitz River, in one of those heavily wooded areas you could only get to by gravel roads that went on forever. It was a camping trip with my dad, my little sister, and 2 of my dad's buddies, guys he'd grown up with. I think one of them brought his teenage son, but the rest of the group was adults and kids. It wasn't an official campground, not one with designated spaces and bathrooms. This was the early 90s, and people still camped wherever they could clear enough flat ground for a tent and get a fire going. I don't think we saw another human being after the first 20 miles of forest road. The place was wild. Dense pine trees, underbrush thick enough to hide behind, and steep ridgelines everywhere you looked. Even the river itself looked a little mean. Fast, cold, and the kind of blue that always made me think of deep water and dangerous currents. We got there sometime in the late afternoon. I remember the light through the trees, how it came down in these soft, dusty beams, and the sound of the river not far from where we pitched camp. It wasn't roaring, but you could hear it constantly, like a low whisper in the background. Dad had parked the truck about 100 feet from the site, off a barely visible track. We set up 2 tents. One for me, my dad, and my sister, and one for his 2 buddies. There was a fire pit already made by someone before us, ringed with blackened stones and a few half-burned logs still off to the side. That first evening felt normal. We gathered wood, cooked hot dogs, and sat around the fire until the stars came out. It was colder than I expected, summer, but with the kind of bite in the air that only comes from being deep in the woods near fast-moving water. We all turned in before it got too late. I remember waking up once during the night, just to pee. The air was dead still, and the forest felt like it was holding its breath. No frogs, no wind, nothing. I finished quick and crawled back into the tent. It was the next night when things went sideways. We'd spent the day hiking upriver. Nothing serious, just followed a game trail along the edge of the water, stepping over logs, pointing out weird rocks, tossing sticks for fun. It was me and my sister and the other kid, with the adults lagging behind. The trail eventually curved uphill and got harder to follow, so we turned back. We got back to camp in the late afternoon and lit the fire again for dinner. By then we all smelled like smoke and pine sap, that dry, crusty smell of dirt and sweat and woods. My hands were coated in dust from climbing over fallen trees all day. Everyone was tired in that quiet, sunburned way. I think my dad cracked open a beer, and one of his friends went down to the river with a fishing rod, though I don't remember him catching anything. The first rock landed just after full dark. It wasn't big, probably no larger than a plum, but it hit close, right on the edge of the fire pit. Everyone stopped talking and looked around, assuming maybe someone tossed it as a joke, but nobody said anything. I looked across the fire at my dad and could tell by his face that he was trying to figure it out too. A second rock came maybe a minute later, then a stick, then another rock. They weren't being thrown all at once or even in quick succession. It was spaced out, random, like whoever or whatever was doing it didn't want to be spotted. It was too deliberate to be chance, though. Too close. They weren't falling from trees. They were coming in at an arc tossed. Dad stood up after one of the rocks landed near the tents. He picked up the flashlight and swept it through the woods beyond the fire. And that's when we saw it. Just the briefest flicker of reflection. Two eyes way too high off the ground. A silhouette behind it. Broad. Still. Maybe 30 or 40 feet back in the woods. Just standing there. The light hit it for a split second, and then it was gone. No sound. No branches breaking. Just gone. Nobody said anything. Nobody screamed or moved. We all just sat there frozen, looking in the direction it had been. The fire was the only thing making light, and suddenly it felt way too small. Dad tossed on a few big pieces of wood, and the flames jumped higher. Sparks shot up into the trees. We stayed awake like that for a long time. Nobody admitted it, but we were waiting for something to happen. Another rock, another stick, another glimpse of whatever that had been. Every time the fire cracked, I flinched. More rocks came. Not a lot, just here and there. One would land near the coolers, another would hit the side of a tent. Always from the same general direction. It was like whoever was doing it was trying to get a reaction, or maybe trying to figure out if we'd run. We didn't. We just sat closer to the fire, fed it bigger and bigger logs, and waited. Eventually, it stopped. One by one, people turned in. I don't remember falling asleep. Just remember watching the embers fade and the sky lighten a little, the way it does just before dawn. But I woke up again. The sound was what did it. Footsteps. Heavy, slow. Not panicked. Just walking. Something was moving through camp, just outside our tent. I could hear it shifting its weight, stepping over things. Then came the smell, thick, sour, and musky, like wet fur and rot. It was so strong I gagged. I thought maybe a dead animal had wandered in. Then I heard my dad sit up. He didn't say anything, just unzipped the tent fast and stepped outside. I could hear him move quickly, then a sudden loud noise, like him banging his hand on the truck bed or shaking something hard. Whatever it was out there ran. I heard branches breaking, something heavy moving through the brush fast, crashing away. After a while, my dad came back in and zipped up the tent again. I didn't ask questions. In the morning, we found tracks. Not like boot prints, bigger, wider. No tread. Just bare imprints in the dirt between the tents and the fire pit. At least a size 14 or 15 if it was a person, but wider than any foot I'd seen. Heavy too. Sunk deeper into the ground than any of ours. Some of our stuff had been knocked over. A water jug was crushed. One of the camp chairs was twisted sideways. The cooler had been opened, but nothing was taken. It was like whoever had come through wasn't looking for food, just testing us. Dad didn't try to explain it. He just looked at the trees for a while, then said we were packing up. Nobody argued. We took everything down in record time, jammed the gear into the truck bed, and were gone before noon. The drive out was quiet. We didn't even stop to eat. Looking back now, it's hard to make sense of what exactly happened. We didn't see anything close up. No one got hurt. Nothing was stolen. It's easy to write it off as nerves, an overactive imagination, or maybe some weird prank by another camper we never saw. But there's something about the way it all happened. The slow build-up, the randomness of it, the quiet, that still sits wrong with me. If it had been a bear, we would have heard it coming. If it had been another person, they'd have run when my dad yelled. Whoever was out there that night didn't want food, didn't want to hurt us. It wanted to see what we'd do. And whatever it was, it stood upright. It had a stride like a man. And it stank like nothing I've ever smelled before or since. I've camped dozens of times since then, in mountains, deserts, by lakes, but I've never gone back to that part of Washington. Not even close, because out there, near the Cowlitz, past the gravel roads and the pine ridges, something was watching us. And I'm not sure it ever left. Me and a friend had been planning the trip for weeks. We both had built up stress from work, and we both needed a break. Nothing sounded better than throwing some gear in the backs of our 4X4S and disappearing into the mountains for a couple of nights. No cell service, no city noise, no emails. Just trees, wind, and dirt. We each had our own rigs. Mine was a beat-up but reliable Wrangler I'd slowly worked on over the years. His was an old Tacoma with a rooftop tent. Between the two of us, we had everything we needed: firewood, propane stove, water, and more junk food than either of us would admit. We didn't really have a solid plan beyond head into the woods and find a spot. That's how we liked it. We set off early that Saturday morning, with enough fuel and food to last a few days. The trail we followed wasn't marked by signs. It was one of those winding, narrow Forest Service roads that people only use when they know exactly where they're going. It twisted deep into the mountains, far past where normal cars could get. Trees pressed close on both sides, and the ground was chewed up in places from past rains and fallen branches. It took us a couple of hours to reach the kind of spot we were looking for, high up on a ridgeline, not too close to any public campgrounds and not too exposed. We found a clearing that looked perfect. It was tucked between some tall pines, the ground flat enough to park our rigs and pitch a tent without rolling down the mountain in our sleep. One side of the clearing dropped off into a steep ravine, probably a couple 100 feet down, filled with more trees and jagged rocks. You could hear water down there somewhere, but it was buried deep under the branches and brush. We spent the afternoon setting up. He got his rooftop tent unfolded, and I pitched my ground tent next to the Wrangler. We collected deadfall for a fire and cracked a couple beers once everything was in place. The sun started to dip behind the trees, throwing long shadows across camp, but the air was still warm with that dry mountain smell. Pine needles, dirt, and something faintly sweet that always made me think of wood smoke and old leaves. Dinner was simple: canned chili heated over the stove, tortillas, and more beer. We didn't talk much, just enjoyed the quiet. That's the thing about camping like that. There's no pressure to talk. It's more about being there, letting your brain slow down. The stars started to show once it got dark. No light pollution out there, just thousands of points blinking overhead, the kind of sky you forget even exists when you live in town. We sat up late just listening to the fire crackle. No traffic, no voices. Every now and then we'd hear something in the distance, maybe a coyote or an owl, but it was never close enough to care. By around midnight, we both turned in. I zipped into my sleeping bag and passed out quickly, warm and full, tired in a way that felt honest. The kind of tired you only get from driving rough trails and hauling firewood. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Must have been deep into the night. Everything was pitch black inside the tent, and the air had cooled down a lot. That deep mountain cold that creeps into your clothes no matter how thick they are. I lay there for a minute, groggy, before I realized why I was awake. I had to piss. Bad. The kind of need that doesn't let you fall back asleep even when you're exhausted. I sighed and groaned as I unzipped the sleeping bag. I reached around for my headlamp, which I'd left hanging on a little loop at the top of the tent. Found it, clicked it on, and blinked against the sudden glare. I pulled on my boots and hoodie, not even bothering to lace them up properly, just enough to get out and back without stepping on something sharp. I unzipped the tent, and cold air spilled in like water. The world outside was quiet, still. No wind, no insects, just dark forest and the occasional creak of trees shifting in place. I stepped out slowly, letting the tent flap close behind me. My headlamp lit up a narrow cone in front of me, catching outlines of tree trunks, dry pine needles, and my breath turning into fog. The fire had burned down to embers, faintly glowing like coals deep in a barbecue. I didn't want to piss too close to camp. Even half asleep, I was trying to follow that unspoken rule of keeping your human scent away from the tents. I walked about 50 or 60 feet out into the woods, finding a spot just past a big boulder. Everything felt fine, cold, quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around you in the deep woods and almost makes you forget you're alone out there. I faced away from camp and started doing my business. That's when I heard it. Behind me, off to the side, maybe 10 feet away, rocks shifting under weight. not like a single pebble falling. No, it sounded like multiple stones being moved or stepped on. Something crunching gravel underfoot. Not fast, just there. My whole body tensed up. Instantly, like a switch flipped in my brain. That quiet panic. The kind that grabs your lungs before your mind catches up. I stopped midstream and listened hard. Didn't move, didn't breathe, nothing. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch falling, maybe frost causing something to crack. But then it came again. Crunch, shuffle, then another. I turned around fast, hand shaking slightly as I raised the beam of my headlamp, and I saw them. Dozens of them. At first I thought it was some kind of reflection, mistake of the light. But they blinked, shifted, moved. They were everywhere, lined up between the trees, scattered just past the edge of the beam, all facing me, watching, maybe 20 pairs, all reflecting that pale, white-blue light from my headlamp. They didn't move forward. They just stared. I stood frozen, couldn't even move, couldn't finish peeing, couldn't breathe properly. My heart hammered so hard I felt it in my ears. Every part of me was waiting for something to lunge, something to make a sound, for the quiet to break. And then, from somewhere among them, a sharp sound cut through the air. Ma triple A. The strangest mix of relief and disbelief hit me like a brick to the chest. Another bleat followed, then another. Goats. A damn herd of mountain goats. Dozens of them just standing there, probably as confused about me as I was about them. My legs were still locked, and my breath hadn't come back fully, but my brain started to catch up. I lowered the light a little and saw the outlines, thick bodies, horns, weird sideways stances on the rocks. Just goats. Wild, shaggy, stubborn-looking mountain goats. And I had nearly pissed myself in front of them. I let out a shaky breath and forced myself to back away slowly, giving them their space. One of them let out another loud bleat, and I flinched again, even though I knew what it was now. Their eyes still tracked me as I stepped back toward camp, boots scuffing quietly on the dirt. They didn't follow. They just kept standing there, watching, probably wondering what kind of weird, hairless animal I was, stumbling through their home with a glowing forehead and a half-closed zipper. Back at the tent, I dropped into my sleeping bag and just stared at the ceiling for a while, heart still pounding. I kept the headlamp on low for a bit, just to make myself feel less alone. Eventually, the adrenaline wore off and sleep crept back in. When I woke up the next morning, everything looked normal. Sunlight was breaking through the trees, the fire pit was cold, and birds were chirping again. I walked back out to where I'd been the night before. There were hoof prints everywhere, small divots in the dirt and rocks, a few tufts of fur on a branch. No predators, no monsters, just a curious herd of goats that had wandered in during the night, probably drawn by our food smell or just investigating some unfamiliar noise. I didn't tell my friend right away, not because I was embarrassed. I was, but more because it was one of those moments that hits differently when it's just yours. The woods had reminded me how small I was, how easily fear takes hold when you're in the dark, alone, surrounded by something you don't understand. Later, when we were packing up camp and getting ready to head back down the trail, I looked out over the ridge one more time. Same trees, same wind, same forest, but it felt different, a little quieter, a little more wild. That trip stuck with me, not because of anything dangerous, but because of how quickly your brain can turn normal into terrifying when you're out of your comfort zone, out in the real world, out where you're not the top of the food chain anymore. Just an ape with a headlamp, pissing in the dark, scared half to death by some goats. And honestly, that's all it takes out there. It happened a couple of years ago during late fall, the time of year when the woods start to quiet down and everything feels like it's holding its breath for winter. My dad and I had decided to take a day hike deep into one of the lesser-used trail networks near where we lived. He's always been a hunter, tracker, and woodsman, and I'd spent enough time with him in the backcountry to learn some basics. I wasn't new to this stuff, but I didn't have his eyes or instinct. He could read the forest like a story. I was still trying to figure out the alphabet. We left early that morning, driving out on old dirt roads for an hour or so until we reached a pull-off near a faded trail marker. From there, it was just forest. Dense pine and spruce, carpeted with fallen needles, the kind of quiet that presses down on your ears. It wasn't raining, but the ground was damp and dark from the night before. The air had that sharp, cold smell that comes right before everything freezes for the season. We were just walking, not hunting. Dad had brought his axe because he always brought something. Said you never know when you might need to clear a fallen log or defend yourself, and I carried a small day pack with water, snacks, and a first aid kit. The trail wasn't well maintained. In fact, it was barely a trail, just a faint line of trampled brush that twisted through the woods, broken up by small streams and game trails. We weren't worried. We'd both grown up in this kind of country. We were about 2 hours in when we found it. We had just come around a slight bend, into a shallow gully where the trees thinned out and the light broke through more clearly. That's when we saw the leg. First, I thought it was a branch, a thick, dark stump jutting out at a weird angle near the base of a fallen tree. But as we got closer, I saw the hair. Coarse, brown, unmistakable. And then the hoof. I stopped walking and just stared. It was a moose leg, a young one, torn off clean at the shoulder joint, bone exposed and red with fresh blood. The edges weren't surgical, they were ragged, torn. Something had ripped it off with force. There wasn't any other part of the body nearby, just the single leg. No drag marks, no scattered entrails, no crows overhead, just that one limb lying in the moss like it had been placed there. It looked fresh. The blood was still wet, soaking into the soil beneath it. The air even smelled like it, coppery and raw. I felt my stomach twist a little, not from nausea, but from the sudden understanding that something violent had happened here. And recently, Dad crouched near it, examining the way the leg was angled and how the surrounding brush was disturbed. I just stood there, watching him, my eyes flicking around the woods like I expected something to jump out. He didn't say much at first, just reached back without turning around and handed me his axe. I took it without a word, feeling the weight of it settle into my hands. Cold metal, worn handle. The edge was sharp. He told me to keep watch while he looked for tracks. I stood off to the side, maybe 10 feet away, near a cluster of saplings. My eyes scanned the woods. Every movement in the trees, every snap of a twig made my heart thump a little harder. It was dead quiet again. No birdsong, no breeze, just the stillness of a forest that had just seen something unnatural. I gripped the axe tighter and kept turning slowly in place, trying to watch all directions at once. A few minutes passed before Dad came back. He wasn't rushing, but he wasn't relaxed either. His face was neutral, but his eyes were focused, scanning around us like he was still thinking. He pointed out some tracks, moose tracks, likely the mother of the calf that had been killed. He showed me where they were shallow at first, then suddenly deeper, spaced farther apart. He explained in that quiet, matter-of-fact way of his that she'd started running. Not trotting, not walking, running, and running away from this spot, not toward it. I asked if he'd seen any predator tracks. He just shook his head. No wolf tracks, no bear tracks, nothing. Not even scuffed earth where a struggle might have happened. Just the moose tracks, as if whatever had taken the calf had floated in and out of the woods without touching the ground. That wasn't possible. Something had killed that calf, and it had done it with such force that it left only one leg behind. Dad wasn't the type to get jumpy, but I noticed he slipped his bear spray out of his pack and carried it in hand as we kept walking. He didn't say anything else. Neither did I. We followed the direction of the moose tracks for a while. They headed uphill, deeper into the thicker part of the forest. The trees were tighter together up there, the brush denser. The light faded faster too. Even though it was still mid-morning, it started to feel like dusk under the canopy. About a mile further in, things felt different. It's hard to explain unless you've spent time alone in the woods, but there's a kind of instinct that kicks in when something's off. Not just fear, but a sense that the environment has changed. The forest got too quiet. There were no bird calls, no rustling, just the sound of our own boots and breathing. I could feel my pulse in my neck, and every step felt loud. We found another sign about 20 minutes later. Hair. Not just a tuft. This was a clump, caught on the rough bark of a pine tree at about shoulder height. It was the same brown color, matted slightly with blood. Not placed there, pulled off. Something had passed close enough, violently enough, to leave part of itself behind. The worst part was that there were no tracks here either. Just the clump of hair and the disturbed bark. And that same eerie silence. We kept going. Slowly, carefully. My hands were starting to sweat inside my gloves even though the air was cold. I had that feeling in my chest, the kind where it gets tight and it's hard to take a full breath. Not quite panic, but close. We came into a clearing not long after that. Maybe 20 yards wide. Grassy in the center, surrounded by trees that leaned in like watchers. There was a foul smell there. Not strong, but present. Not rot, just wrong. Musky, maybe. Animal. But not one I recognized. Dad motioned for us to stop, and we stood there on the edge of the clearing for a minute. I looked around, slowly, every tree feeling like it might be hiding something just out of sight. The axe in my hand felt heavier by the second. There were no signs of a den, no tracks, no kill site. Just empty space and silence. I started to wonder if we should even be there. I was used to being in the woods, but this was different. This wasn't just the usual wildlife behavior. This was something else. Something that didn't leave tracks. Something that could scare off a full-grown moose without even a fight. Eventually, Dad said we should turn back. We didn't speak much on the way out. Every sound behind us made me turn my head. A branch creaking, a squirrel moving in the brush, a crow in the distance. It all sounded too close, too sharp, like it didn't belong. When we finally made it back to the trailhead, the tension broke, but only just. I didn't feel fully safe until we were back in the truck with the doors shut. Dad didn't say much the whole ride home, and I didn't ask questions. We never figured out what killed that calf. Could have been a bear, maybe. A rare one that left no tracks and didn't leave a mess. Could have been a cougar, though they usually don't rip legs off without dragging the whole body. Maybe it was wolves and we just missed the signs. Or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that I've never felt that kind of pressure in the woods before or since. I've been camping, hiking, hunting. Nothing ever got to me like that. Nothing ever made the hair on my neck stand up like that. Sometimes I still think about it when I'm out on my own. I'll hear something snap behind me or catch a strange smell on the wind, and I'll remember standing there with an axe in my hands, waiting for something I couldn't see. And now, even when I go hiking on a short trail, I keep a blade on me. I carry bear spray. I pay more attention to the way birds go quiet, or when a trail suddenly feels wrong under my boots. Because whatever was out there that day, it didn't want to be seen. It didn't want to leave signs. And whatever it was, even the mother moose decided not to fight it. She just ran. I think about that part the most. It was a warm, muggy morning when my boyfriend and I decided to take a nature trail out near one of the swamp preserves we had heard about online. The area was quiet, not really advertised, mostly known by locals and a few hikers who liked less traveled paths. We'd been trying to get outdoors more often, get away from phones and screens, and this seemed like a good place for that. The drive out to the preserve took a while. It started with main roads, then highways, then winding back roads that narrowed and cracked the further we got. Eventually, we hit gravel and then dirt. By the time we pulled off to the small parking patch near the trailhead, there wasn't another car in sight. Just forest, swamp, and still air. We sprayed ourselves down with bug repellent before heading in. The entrance wasn't marked with much. A rotted wooden sign barely hanging off one post and a faded map on a splintered board under cloudy plastic. The trail looped through wetlands and forest, about 4 miles in total, and we figured we'd take it slow. Enjoy the quiet, maybe see some birds or turtles. First, it was peaceful, mostly shaded, with big oak trees draped in moss and palmettos lining both sides of the trail. The dirt was dry, the ground soft with old leaves, and the only sounds were cicadas and birds overhead. Every so often we'd hear water off in the distance, sometimes still, sometimes trickling, and once or twice we thought we heard something big move in the brush. But that's normal in Florida. Armadillos or raccoons. Nothing unusual. About a mile in, the trail opened up slightly. The forest cleared to our left where a thin strip of water ran parallel to the path. More of a marshy canal than a stream. The water was still, greenish from algae, and shaded in parts by overhanging branches. We kept walking, slowing our pace, looking for turtles on logs or herons near the edge. That's when we saw it. At first, it didn't register. It just looked like a piece of bark or maybe an old root pulled up from the bank. But as we got closer, the shape became clearer. It was thick and muscular with a bony ridge running down the middle, scales, and claws. It was a section of an alligator's tail, maybe 1.5 feet long, ending in what looked like a clean tear, not cut, but ripped. Just behind it, a front foot lay on its side, the toes splayed, claws dark and curled, skin still damp. I stopped walking. My heart jumped like it missed a beat. It wasn't old. The blood around the edges of the tail and foot was still wet, still glistening in the light filtering through the canopy. It hadn't started to dry or attract flies yet. This wasn't roadkill or leftovers from days ago. This had happened recently, maybe an hour, maybe less. We both stood there staring at it. The silence felt heavier now. There was no wind, no buzzing, just our breathing and that awful stillness that settles in when something isn't right. I remember the thought that came to me first. I had no idea what was big enough to rip apart an alligator. I mean, we were in alligator country. We expected to see one or two along the trail, maybe sunning themselves near the water or slipping back into the murk as we passed. But seeing a piece of one, just a chunk of its tail and 1 foot, no body, no blood trail, no drag marks, that felt different. It felt like we had just stumbled across the first scene in one of those documentaries where something unnatural is about to be discovered. Something that kills apex predators. I could feel my hands get clammy. My boyfriend looked tense, too, shifting his weight from 1 foot to the other and glancing around the woods like he expected something to burst out of the brush. Neither of us said anything. There was no point. We just stood there, staring and trying to understand. Eventually, we moved on. Slowly, the trail curved a bit and hugged the edge of the water. There was a low wooden barrier made of logs, probably more for show than safety, and we followed it, scanning the surface of the water and the shoreline as we walked. Maybe another few hundred feet ahead, the trail opened up into a wider clearing. The water here formed a small basin, like a natural pond or bend in the canal. The bank sloped down gently, muddy and lined with reeds. And standing right there, in plain view, was the biggest alligator I've ever seen in my life. It was huge, easily 10 feet, maybe more. Dark, almost black, with thick, scaly skin and a wide, muscular tail. Its body looked like it had been carved from tire rubber, dense and heavy. And clamped tightly in its jaws was another alligator. A smaller one, dead, limp, probably 4 or 5 feet long, a juvenile maybe, held by the belly with its head and tail hanging lifeless on either side. The big one was just standing there, holding the smaller one like a toy, its jaws clamped down, not moving. It didn't flinch or turn toward us. It just stood on the edge of the water, silent, still, and holding its kill like it was proud of it. My breath caught in my throat. Every part of me wanted to back away slowly, but I couldn't move at first. The realization hit me all at once. The thing that had torn apart the first alligator wasn't some mystery predator. It was just another alligator. Alligators eat alligators. I'd heard about it before, maybe in passing or in a nature show, but I never thought I'd see it. And I never expected to stumble across the aftermath like we had. It was one thing to read about something like that. It was something completely different to stand a stone's throw from it while it was still happening. The bigger gator finally turned, slipping into the water with barely a sound. The smaller one still hung from its mouth as it glided into the pond and vanished beneath the surface. Not a ripple, not a splash. It was like it melted into the swamp. We stood there for a long moment after it disappeared. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching us from just under the surface. Just sitting there, motionless, waiting. The silence returned. Thick, complete. My ears rang a little with it. The buzz of the insects hadn't come back yet, and I noticed the birds were still gone too. Like everything around us had gone mute out of caution. We turned around then. We didn't talk. We didn't linger. We didn't finish the loop. We just turned and walked the same way we came in. I kept glancing over my shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see those eyes watching us through the brush or a shape rising out of the water again. The forest looked different on the way back. More closed in, more shadowed. The open feel it had earlier that morning was gone. Now it felt like everything had drawn tighter, like we had seen something we weren't supposed to, and the woods were pushing us out. When we got back to the car, I felt that weight lift. The heat, the bugs, the mud, none of it mattered anymore. We just sat there for a minute with the engine running, windows up, air conditioning blowing, trying to shake off that thick feeling of dread. That day taught me a few things. First, that nature doesn't care about your comfort or your expectations. It's not predictable. It's not always peaceful. And second, that the scariest part of being in the deep woods isn't what you don't know. It's what you do know and still can't control. I still go hiking, still get out into the wild when I can. But I pay more attention now. I look harder at the ground. I watch the water longer. And I never assume I understand what's going on just because I've read a fact in a book. That day in the swamp, I thought we were about to come face to face with something unknown, some freak predator, something unnatural. But the truth was worse. It was just another gator, doing what gators do, tearing each other apart for territory, food, or maybe just instinct. And it didn't care if we saw it or not. It was a reminder that we're visitors out there. No matter how much experience we think we have, or how safe a trail might feel, we're always just guests in someone else's territory. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing you'll see isn't some monster hiding in the shadows. It's something you've seen 100 times before, doing something you hoped it never would. I've always been someone who liked being out in the woods. The quiet, the stillness, the way everything slows down once you're far enough away from roads and towns. It's like the weight of life just falls off your shoulders, and all that's left is your next step, your next breath, and whatever's just past the next tree. That's why I took the trip. I'd had a long few months. Work stress, family stuff, too many late nights and early mornings. I just needed to unplug, so I packed my gear, loaded up the truck, and headed out to a forest I'd only been to once before. An area up north where the trails got narrow, and the trees grew thick, and where you could walk all day without seeing another person. I brought everything I needed: my pack, my tent, food, bear spray, my small hatchet, first aid kit. I checked everything twice. I even left my phone off. This trip was about being alone and away. The first day out there went smooth. I hiked in late morning and spent most of the day cutting off the main trail, bushwhacking into deeper woods. The terrain was rougher than I remembered. More roots, thicker brush, steeper ridges. But I liked it that way. The harder it got, the more real it felt. I set up camp by a stream. There was a small, flat clearing just big enough for my one-man tent, with trees all around and a nice open view of the water. I made a small fire, boiled water, ate, and sat there just listening to the woods as the sun went down. Birds faded into crickets. Wind rustled through the pine needles above me. I could feel the world getting quieter by the minute. That night was colder than I expected. I slept in my clothes, zipped up tight, my hat pulled down to my eyes. I woke up a few times to the sound of branches cracking, maybe something moving in the trees, but that's normal. Squirrels, deer, raccoons. I didn't think much of it. By morning, frost had formed on the outside of my tent. The air was sharp and clean. I boiled more water for oatmeal, packed up camp, and hiked deeper. My plan was simple: go as far as I could through the woods, stay one more night, and loop back toward the truck the next day. Around early afternoon, I started noticing signs that I wasn't alone out there. Tracks scat. Some of it was probably from deer, maybe a moose farther north, but some of it was different. The prints looked canine, bigger than most dogs, and more spaced out. I thought maybe coyotes at first, but something about the spacing and depth felt off. I wasn't a tracker, but I'd seen prints like that before in books, and they made me slow down without really thinking about it. I kept walking, stopped less, took shorter breaks. Something in the back of my head had clicked on and wouldn't shut off. That evening, I didn't set up camp by water. I found a spot further from open space, half hidden under thick tree cover and slightly elevated. I built a small fire again, more for comfort than anything else, and sat with my back to a thick pine trunk. The stars came out sharp, cold, and quiet. Nothing moved. The forest around me felt still in that tense, watching kind of way. No wind, no bugs, just frozen air and brittle silence. I barely slept. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place right away. Not branches, not leaves. It was soft and slow, and it came in bursts almost like breathing. Heavy, measured, too heavy for a small animal. I didn't move, just lay there and listened. It circled the tent once, then again, paused. Then I heard a low grunt, almost like a deep exhale, and then it was gone. I stayed awake until daylight started to break, eyes wide, hand on the handle of my hatchet. When the sun came up, I stepped outside the tent and saw prints in the dirt. Clear, deep, not dog, not coyote. These were large, spaced wide, and fresh. They circled my tent, passed through the edge of my camp, and led off into the brush. I didn't eat that morning. I packed everything quickly, double-checked the straps, and started heading back the way I came. The plan was out. I didn't care about finishing the loop. I just wanted to get back to the truck. By mid-morning, I'd already covered more than half the distance I'd done the previous day. I pushed hard, barely stopping, just drinking from my bottle and moving. My mind was racing with what-ifs, what I'd heard, what those prints meant. I kept looking over my shoulder, stopping to listen. But the forest stayed quiet, that fake, staged kind of quiet. And then, about 2 hours from where I thought the truck should be, I saw it. I was cutting through a cluster of spruce trees, thick and close, when I came into a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across. And on the other side, just past the sunlight edge where the trees started again, it stood there. A wolf, not a dog, not a coyote, not something you could mistake. It was huge, broad chest, thick coat, tall legs, gray and white fur that looked matted near the belly. Its eyes locked on me the second I stepped out into the open. It didn't move, just stared. I froze. I didn't even breathe at first. My heart was hammering, but my legs went numb, like my brain hadn't caught up yet. I could see the steam of its breath in the cold air, the way its ears twitched, upright and alert. For a long second, nothing moved. Then it took one step forward. I took one back slowly. My hands stayed low. No sudden motion. I remembered that running was the worst thing you could do. I didn't even reach for the hatchet or the spray. I just backed up, keeping my eyes on it without staring directly into its face. Another step. Then it stopped again. I couldn't tell if it was curious or testing me. Maybe both. I kept moving back, slowly into the trees. Branches scraped my arms, tore at my sleeves. I didn't care. I just needed cover between me and it. The trees would help. That's what I kept telling myself. The trees would help. After maybe 15 yards, I looked back up, and it was gone. Just gone. No sound. No flash of movement. It was just no longer there. I waited, listened, couldn't hear a thing. I didn't walk after that. I jogged. Not full speed, just fast enough to make distance. My body stayed tense the whole time, every muscle coiled. Every few minutes, I'd stop, turn, scan the trees, listen. But there was nothing. It was worse than if I had seen it again. That last stretch back to the truck felt like it went on forever. My legs were burning, and my breath was ragged. But I didn't stop. I didn't trust the silence anymore. When I finally broke through the last line of trees and saw the dirt lot with my truck still sitting there, I almost laughed. The sun was overhead now, bright and warm, but I still had that cold feeling on the back of my neck. I didn't even bother changing clothes or dusting off. I just threw my pack in the bed, climbed in, and locked the doors. Started the engine, pulled out, didn't look back. The drive home was quiet. My hands shook a little on the wheel. The road felt too smooth, the air too calm, like none of it matched what I'd just come from. Even now, I keep thinking about it. The prints, the way it circled my tent, the way it stood in the clearing like it had been waiting. like it knew where I was going to be. There was no attack, no blood, no wild chase through the trees. But that doesn't make it less terrifying, because that's the thing about the deep woods. You can prepare for weather, terrain, getting lost, but you can't prepare for something with its own mind, its own plan. That wolf didn't need to growl or lunge or bare its teeth. It just needed to be there, to let me know I wasn't in charge. That no matter how much gear I brought or how quiet I walked or how careful I planned, out there I didn't matter. I was just another creature passing through. And if it had wanted to, it could have ended things differently. That was the worst part. Chose not to.